a student of English literature, and in English literature we have feminist literary theory and feminist literary criticism, and all we do in feminist literary criticism or feminist theory is to find documents which we think are phallocentric, quote unquote, or documents which are prepared by or authored by dominating male figures, right? And then we say that, okay, women have been absent, women had not been given enough space. And so we do a kind of a feminist critiques of these texts. So we say that this text is masculinist, this text is sexist, this text is misogynist because it did not have enough space for women. So I was thinking, and there was, when I just started working on this book in 2005, I have a dual interest in literature and law, but literature was my prime interest at that point, and literature and law because my father is a lawyer, so and law because it touches upon our lives in many ways. So I just thought, okay, what about the Constitution of India? You say that Shakespeare is misogynist. You say that Macbeth is a misogynist text, or Milton's Paradise Lost is a misogynist text. And then what about the Constitution of India? And strangely, and not very strangely actually, it's part of India's history that when I was working on this book sometime, say 2004-5, around the time when I had started looking into this, there was not much faith in the Constitution. People were losing faith in the Constitution. Some were feeling that it has failed to do. It has failed us. Instead of asking the other question whether we have failed the Constitution or not, and there were. I mean, I made some references in the book too, but there were in a kind of a in number of important legal historians, legal experts, constitutional experts who would critique the Constitution, saying that it is not, it does not pay much attention to women's issue, gendered issues. It's a gender neutral Constitution and thereby patriarchal and so on, including feminist thinkers. So I thought, okay, fine, fine. I mean, so the Constitution is misogynist, the Constitution is sexist, as many people are saying. So maybe I can write a paper or two on why it is not so gender sensitive. And part of the reason is that it is drafted by founding fathers. So if founding fathers draft the Constitution, then it is bound to be more, it is bound to be informed by masculine perspectives. But then I started discovering, my father in a very casual conversation, somewhat, sarcastically told me, you guys don't even know that there were so many women in the Constituent Assembly, and they were all, just find out about them. And once I started discovering them, I found that all of these are extremely important women, remarkable women, very bold, courageous, thoughtful, visionary women. And they had also played important role in both women's movement and in the nationalist movement. And yet we have never thought about the fact that they could have played some role in the making of the Constitution. So when I began, I thought I will write an article about the Constitution and do a similar kind of a feminist critique of the Constitution, maybe write an article using these historical facts that it's derived from founding fathers' vision. Even now, people keep writing founding fathers kind of books. Then I discovered that no, I mean, there is not just the fact that that the Constitution is deeply indebted to these women, but and we have forgotten them. But there is also a politics in forgetting these women. So if you look at the title of the book, one part is Founding Mothers of the Indian Republic. The second part, I don't know whether, because I'm not an expert in law, but still the second part is about the gender politics of the framing of the Constitution. I think there should be a third subtitle, which is about the gender politics of not remembering these women. So why would we not remember? Because there was it was like a given fact. Even when I was telling people, I was young, of course, so maybe I could not present my ideas in a very convincing manner, but very eminent people, historians, political thinkers would tell me, but what difference would it have made, even if these 10, 12 women were there in the Constituent Assembly? I mean, it was probably just a token presence, and they were very dismissive. So I was also, for a very long time, since we talk about the process of writing of this book, enamored of these theories of text and feminist critiques of masculinist, phallocentric texts, as they call them. We have this feminist critique, as the term is used. And then I completely changed my perspective. And I started looking at letters by these women. I started looking at their personal correspondence, the institutional correspondence, the correspondence of the various office holders of All India Women's Conference with each other or with other organizations. And I was completely stunned to see the kind of investment these women had in the making of the constitution, the strategies that they had, the kind of visions they had. And then the archives started giving me a completely new picture. So there were two, I think, stages in which the work was done. The first one, which has gone into which was the theoretical part, when I was not aware of the archives. So I was only looking at the founding fathers. And the second was when I started looking at the archives and I started looking at the right archives. Maybe I can tell you more about that later, but the right archives, meaning where to actually look for the women's voices, because they have been there and for 60, 70 years, we have not looked at them. So there must be something wrong about our method of doing the constitutional history. So one was, of course, the prejudice that you assume that women couldn't have done much. So why bother? Why waste our time trying to find out what they have done? But the second was also the fact that we were not aware of the strategies that women had, that they were not speaking in the same manner as men were doing. So you will not find their records in the same archives where men's contribution to the constitution can be found, and so on. So that was the first phase, and which has gone into the book as the first two chapters, where I talk a lot about, the figure of the founding fathers, or the authority of the founding fathers, and how that authority, I call them almost like a preemptive closer to the inquiry even before it started. Because they are founding fathers, you don't need to find out about the founding mothers. So that was one part. And then the second part was the archival research, the book Founding Mothers of the Indian Constitution. So I sometimes say, simply to provoke you, to ask you to think, what if the constitution was not drafted by founding fathers but founding mothers? Would you have then looked at the document differently? Would you have made different interpretations out of the same articles? If I tell you that this article was drafted not by a man but by a woman, would it make any difference to legal history of India? Would that make any difference to how the judges interpret the constitution? So that is probably a kind of possibility that has that has emerged in the last 5-10 years. There are two things which have come from the reviews. One is, of course, that yes, this asks us to revisit the constitution, think about the constitution once again. But one question that many people have asked, to which I think there is a very, very solid answer in the figure of Dakshayani Velayudan in the book itself, which is about the elitism of these women. So don't you think that these women in the Constituent Assembly were elite women? But I don't want to answer that question completely, because I think that elitism is also a relative term. So you can be elite in one circle, but you're not elite in another circle, and so on. So, but there are there are questions about the reviews have made me think, but I think some of the answers are there in the book itself about thinking of these women as a collective. Right, instead of thinking of them as individual members one by one. The second thing that people have asked, and that's, I think, what I would probably now work on, is why do I consider these women so radical? And this question comes, I would not say this is a critical question. This is somewhat, this is both, it cuts both ways. So the question about the radicalism, I think this is done from a presentist perspective. So you compare women who were feminists in the 1930s and 40s with feminists of 2020s and 2010 and 2020s. So that, I think, is something that has emerged. But the archives suggest that even by the standards of our times, even by the standards of 2020, these women were sufficiently radical. To imagine that, to think of Hansa Mehta standing up in the United Nations Human Rights Commission and saying, when the entire world is saying that the UDHR draft was like, the family is the basic unit of society. Okay, these are the Western countries which is that are saying this, and here is an Indian woman getting up and saying, "No, we should not say that the family is the unit of a society. It is the individual who is the unit of a society." I think that's a very radical thing to say. To say in 1930s and 40s that we need to recognize the economic right of housework or economic value of the work done by the homemaker, the housewife, quote unquote, right, is very radical. To say in 1947, when we were going through the turmoils of partition and the attending violence, that we should have a provision in the Constituent Assembly, in the Constitution, making it a fundamental right for anyone to marry any partner, a Hindu girl or a Muslim girl marrying a Muslim boy or a Hindu boy, right? Interreligious marriage, right, is very radical in the context of a country when we have discourses around love jihad and so on and so forth, right? To put the word sex, again, knowing fully well that all words have the potential of exploding semantically, meaning wise in legal interpretation. So this is what these women knew very well. I mean, they were all lawyers. They were all very, very closely. They paid close attention to the language of the text that they were working on. So to insert the word sex in nearly all articles of the Indian Constitution, in the chapter on fundamental rights and directive principles, which then become I think becomes the kind of the springboard on which a number of gender rights activism in this country are based, right? Whether it's the LGBT rights or the rights of same-sex marriage debate that was happening, or even something as material as equal pay for equal work, right? So all of this, I think, is radical by any standard in the history of feminism in India and abroad. So that's something that I think these are the two major, I would say, responses which I'm getting from the readers, to which I also want to respond. But apart from that, I have been extremely fortunate, and this is one of my passions, that I've been talking about this book to various school students. And I have done various workshops with school children in Kolkata, in Pune, in various other places, including my hometown in Jharkhand, and school children, college children, children from extremely marginalized communities, women, girl children, and so on. And that has made me very happy. I mean, that is the response you didn't. I take a lot of, maybe I can use the word pride here, in the fact that very poor students who I have taught, have saved a lot of money to buy an expensive book, and they've read it through. And after reading this book, they have wanted to read the Constitution. They have wanted to read a Constitution which they think uh, embodies the vision of women or mothers, and quote unquote, once again, mothers who did not ever want to claim anything, who did not want to get any kind of recognition, but who did selfless work to ensure that the future citizen of this country will get all their rights. So that is probably the best. Uh, to my mind, the most touching response that I've got from the readers. I think it is important for us to remember that not all feminists know that they are feminists. Not all feminists call themselves feminists. And we don't need to take them on their face value. So they may not say, but they are doing work which is exactly feminist. And it's a term that keeps on reinventing itself. But it is also to be noticed. I mean, that's something that some reviewers have also written. I think Rosalind Parr, in a recent review of the book, had written something like this. So I think we need to remember that although some of these women were not calling themselves feminists, or they were telling that we are not narrow feminists, right? There was also a parallel discourse in which they were received as feminists. So when Renuka Ray visited the US in 1935, the Los Angeles Times publishes a news saying Indian feminists Ray has arrived. She's fighting against child marriage. Okay. So, and she did not object. She did not say, oh, no, no, I'm not feminist. So she understood that the word feminism in different parts of the world had different kinds of resonances. To say that we are not narrow feminists might probably mean that we are very wide ranging or broad feminists. It doesn't mean that we are not feminists at all. I find one major contribution of these women to Indian feminist thought could be the fact that they represented each other. So we have Begum Sharifa Hamid Ali, who is talking about the Hindu reform. Here's a Muslim woman talking about reforms in the Hindu law. Begum Azaz Rasool talking about reforms in the Hindu law, and the Hindu women are not objecting to that. You have upper caste Savarna feminist women. I don't think they were Savarna, but they were not Savarna feminists, saying that there is a lot that we can learn from the practices and customs of the Dalit communities, right? So they are willing to learn from them. And you have a Dalit feminist like Dakshayani Velayudan, who is, of course, contesting on some occasions, but also completely working in a complete collaboration with the upper caste feminist women there. So the fact that there is a kind of feminism which is inclusive, which is intersectional, and yet not bursting out in seams, but coming together, that is something that they were doing. So that's something that I think is very important for us to understand, that Indian feminism has a very distinct shape. So one thing that we can understand about India from the reading of a book like this, or from the research that the book presents before the readers, is the fact that we had a feminism which was intellectually very sophisticated, politically very nuanced, had a program of action. So I say in the preface of the book that the Indian Constitution was written by the will and the consent of Indian women. By will, I mean something that they deliberately planned. So there was a program of action. They wanted certain things. And then there was a consent that they gave to certain ideas that came from outside. Okay, where they had to work in collaboration, where they might also have, they probably had compromise because they wanted some bigger gain and so on. So there is a very specific character of Indian feminism, Indian women's movement, which is international, which is intersectional, which is inclusive, which is petition based, which is driven through texts, which also tries to create a constituency of women as a minority that needs to be attended to, which is also aware of other problems. So, after the making of the constitution, Renuka Ray, Hansa Mehta, Durga Bai, all of them worked with the help of the constitution towards the improvement of the lives of scheduled caste communities, scheduled tribe communities, and various other marginalized communities, also for international peace. So here's a feminism which is not limited only to women's issues. I think major understanding of Indian, I think, is of the Indian Constitution itself. So not a single important issue that we have in the Indian democratic discourse or around Indian democracy and Indian constitutionalism that we have now uh, can be will be left the same if you start taking into account the positions taken by these women, whether it is the labor rights, whether it is the redefinition of family as it is happening in these neoliberal times, whether it is about the role of the state as a welfare state, the state as a draconian state. It is about about this responsibility of the state, whether it is about the personal law reforms, the uniform civil code, secularism, the idea of codification versus customary law, even something which is, I mean, not one of the biggest issues of our times, safety of women, violence against women, the idea of substantive equality versus formal equality. So the question of reservation or affirmative action being one major way of improving or changing the status quo of Indian society, thinking of a feminism without borders, thinking of something like, we have a number of very draconian anti-terrorism laws in this country, preventive detention and so on. So right to liberty, the independence of judiciary, the idea of military. In the Constituent Assembly, Legislative, Ijaz Rasool and Dakshayani Velayudhan were also opposing what later on became the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, AFSPA. So there is not a single important issue in contemporary India which we try to understand by an understanding of through an understanding of the constitution that will not be better understood, or we do not get a new perspective on that if you take into account what these women were doing through the 1930s and 1940s. There is a lot of unfinished work that these women had started, from the 1930s and 40s, which we now need to again remember that this is a work that they had started, and we need to go back to their vision, maybe contest them on some occasions, and then try to finish that project. So in certain ways, this book is just as I say that this is a book which this is an invitation to the readers and to the citizens of India to unforget these women. I think the Constitution of India is also an unfinished project, which was initiated by these women. 1931, the Karachi Congress, Kamaladevi was playing a major role. So from that time onwards, and we are, I would say, there's a moral imperative for all of us to return to these founding mothers and see what vision they had, and ask ourselves how much of their vision have we been able to, fulfill, and what is left to be done. I just wanted to remind the audience or the readers that it was not anybody's generosity, which is the standard idea, that brought these women to the Constituent Assembly. They came to the Constituent Assembly out of their own will, with a lot of hard work. There were many attempts to scuttle their election to the Constituent Assembly. There were people from all kinds of right-wing groups writing, campaigning against their election. There were people from the various communities that these women were representing who did not want them to be elected to the Constituent Assembly. So I just wanted to remember this, that the Constituent Assembly, or women's being in the Constituent Assembly, was not any form of accidental event. It happened because they tried to come into the Constituent Assembly. They struggled to come into the Constituent Assembly. And although only 11 of them got to sign on that final draft of the Indian Constitution, there were at least 40 to 50 women who wanted to come into the Constituent Assembly. And in the Constituent Assembly, the men were telling, imagine what will happen to the Parliament of India if if there are 200 women in the parliament. If 10 are like this, if 10 can make such a difference, and 10 can be so challenging and so difficult to deal with, what would we do if 200 women get elected to the parliament? So this is something that I think we need to remember at a time when we are talking about, increasing women's role, women's parliamentary representation, and so on. So that's why I say that it's not just women's consent. Okay, so you make a constitution, we give our consent. No, it's the will of the women, which is deeply embedded in the will of we the people, that the Indian Constitution embodies. And this book is a history of that will. It is the history of what that will could achieve, and also of what it could not achieve, but probably has left for us to achieve.